Hello, friends. I hope all is well with you. So, today I'm going to talk about possibly one of the most significant things connected with Ernest Satow that I can possibly find. And you may realize that I've put rather a lot of videos up already uh, about Satow, all connected with Satow in some sense. His diaries, his religious research. Yesterday I did one on his Buddhism, and so on and so forth. Sorry, his Buddhism, his research into Buddhism. Let's get that right. But what I want to do today is to talk about British policy, which is a back translation of a title which was given to three anonymous and untitled articles which he wrote for the Japan Times between March and May 1866. And so this all sounds a little complicated, and it is a little bit. So what I want to do first is to share this document. Just a moment, please. Right, I hope you can see that. This is a paper which I wrote for the Bulletin of Kyushu Institute of Technology way back in 1996, isn't it? It says they're received November 29th, 1996, a long time ago when I was very green in judgment as regards researching Satow, about a couple of years into it, I suppose, or even less than that. This is from the Bulletin of the Kyushu Institute of Technology, Kyushu Kogyo Daigaku in Japanese, Human and Social Sciences section, number 45, pages 33 to 41. You can see page 33 here on this copy of the paper. All right, so the title of the paper, as you can see, is Ernest Satow, British Policy and the Meiji Restoration. And I think it's more or less, this paper has more or less stood the test of time, but there need to be a few things added to it. So I want to go through it, and I also want to read from the British policy, the text of British policy. We have two of the three articles have been found. Unfortunately, the second one of the three has not, which is why I did a back translation from Japanese back into English. And this is part of what this paper contains. All right, so here we go. Abstract. I'm going to make it a bit bigger. Yeah. Oops. This paper seeks to examine Ernest Satow's involvement in the publication of three anonymous articles in the Japan Times of 1866 and attempts to assess the effects of the articles known in Japanese as Eikoku Sakuron, which, if you translate it back into English, is British policy. As the second of the three articles in English has not yet been located, a complete retranslation from the Japanese, believed to be the first ever published, is included. Okay. It's not a very long paper, as you can see. I think it's eight pages, but anyway. So, genesis of Eikoku Sakuron. It is not clear what motivated Ernest Satow, the young interpreter who first arrived in Japan in 1862, to dabble imprudently and impudently in political matters by writing the three untitled and anonymous articles for the Japan Times of 1866, which later became known in Japanese as Eikoku Sakuron, British policy, and were assumed mistakenly to represent the official British line. Okay, that's sort of the crux of the matter, more or less, right there. And the influence that this paper, or sorry, not this paper, Satow's writing had, or the possible influence it may have had on the elite of Japan at the time and the movement from the Tokugawa shogunate towards the Meiji Restoration. Professor Machida says that it was a huge influence, and he gives some evidence for that. So that is something which has come to light a long time after this paper was first written anyway. At the time, Satow was still only 22 years old. Was he, with the encouragement of Charles Rickerby, then editor of the newspaper, contemplating a change of career towards journalism? It's possible. His father wrote at one point saying, please come home from Japan to England and I'll start you up in the legal profession. He was still very young, let's not forget. In 1866, he was not even, in March of that year when the first article came out, he wasn't even 23, he was 22, born on June the 30th, 1843. Okay, so yes, it's possible, I suppose. He was dabbling in journalism. But anyway, he was invited by Rickerby to write whatever he liked for the paper. This is one of the things that seems to happen in Japan, that people who stay a little bit longer, shall we say, get interesting offers. That's my experience as well. Okay, anyway, so Rutherford Alcock's views are that he had been the minister in Japan, the first one, but by this time in 1860, he left in 1864 or 5, I can't quite remember. And Parkes came in 1865, or maybe Alcock left in 1864, and there was a chargé d'affaires, Colonel Neal, I think, for a while, instead of a minister. And then Parkes became the second, Sir Harry Parkes became the second minister in 1865. All right, so Sir Rutherford Alcock's views on the paramount importance of trade influenced Satow strongly. This was the classic British position, of course. If we're not going to make a colony of a place, we want to trade with it. And that was the 19th century view in a nutshell, I suppose, of imperial expansion. And certain similarities have been noticed between the proposals put before the British Foreign Minister, Lord Clarendon, by Matsuki Koan of Satsuma at almost the same time, and those made by Satow, and this is Ishii 1966. It's a Japanese scholar with an end note, I think that is, not footnote. In Satow's memoirs, we read, okay, so this is quoting from a diplomat in Japan. I hope I can scroll down without the thing jumping on me. It always does. Let's see. Oh, good. Scrolling is okay. Right. In Satow's memoirs, we read, on one occasion, I went away for a few days with Charles Rickerby of the Japan Times, and having thus become intimate with him, was permitted to try my inexperienced pen in the columns of his paper. My first attempt was an article on traveling in Japan, but before long, an incident occurred which tempted me to write on politics. The incident to which, oh dear, it has jumped. The incident to which Satow refers was the arrival early in March 1866 at Yokohama of a steamer from Satsuma intending to trade with foreigners. The captain of the ship had planned to sell his cargo to Europeans, relying on the Treaty of Edo, signed between Britain and Japan in English, Japanese, and Dutch on August 26, 1858. Article 14 of the treaty was designed to guarantee free trade, the overpowering reason for the British presence in Japan. It read in part, with the exception of munitions of war, which shall only be sold to the Japanese government and foreigners, they, i.e. foreigners, may freely buy from Japanese and sell to them any articles that either may have for sale without the intervention of any Japanese officers in such purchases or sale, or in making or receiving payment for the same, and all classes of Japanese may purchase, sell, keep, or use any articles sold to them by British subjects. In spite of this provision, the shogunal authorities quarantined the vessel, the Satsuma vessel, isolating it on the Kanagawa side of the bay, and in the end, no trade took place. All right, so, and then we've got, I talk about the first of the three anonymous articles. The treaty has no effect. Satow explained in the first article of the series of three, dated March 16th, 1866, that the part of Article 14 quoted above was currently a dead letter. Fears for the safety of foreigners in previous years had caused the foreign diplomats to request that retainers, kerai, of daimyos, should be kept out of the settlement of Yokohama. Various life-threatening and fatal incidents had occurred, including the assassination of Hendrik Huisken, January 15th, 1861, and the murder of Charles Richardson on the Tokaido, September 14th, 1862. That was just after Satow had arrived in Japan for the first time. The country was still seething with Joi-ronsha, two-sworded men who were ready to use violence to exclude the white devils. Well, on the whole topic of joy, I've recently translated Professor Machida's book and put all of it on all of my translation on YouTube if you want to find it. There is a playlist. Because of these dangers, the shogunate had been asked to keep all undesirables at a distance. As Satow points out, it was not reasonable to ask the shogun's officials to make an exception in just this particular case after they had complied with the requests previously deemed necessary. Yet he also felt that the diplomatic representatives could not be blamed for making the requests in the first place. The treaty had been signed by Lord Elgin for Britain and 6 high-ranking Japanese for the shogunate, but as Satow indicated, the tycoon, or shogun, he was called tycoon at the time, was not in a position to sign for the whole of Japan, even though he had done so. It must be borne in mind that the tycoon, though claiming to conduct the government of Japan, is in reality, or was at the time when the first treaties were made, only the head of a confederation of princes, and to arrogate to himself the title of ruler in a country of which only about half was subject to his jurisdiction was a piece of extraordinary presumption on his part. Here, Satow pinpoints the structural flaw in the Constitution of Japan, which pointed in the end to the Meiji Restoration. To have a defective treaty with one half of Japan, the shogun, was in the end of no use to the foreigners. They needed a new treaty with the whole country. In other words, a treaty with the, quotation marks, real head of Japan, no less a person than the emperor himself. For this purpose, ratification by the emperor of the existing 1858 treaties, already achieved in 1865, was not sufficient. Whoops. Let's see. I hope I haven't missed anything there. No, that's the end of the page, so we can go to the next page. In addition, the first part of the clause from Article 14 quoted above was already invalidated, as daimyos, notably Satsuma and Choshu, had pressured the shogun into allowing them to buy arms, albeit subject to the supervision of Edo officials. A radical change. In the first article, Satow gravely and seriously proposed a radical change. At this stage, he did not, however, consider a new treaty with the Mikado, the emperor, but with the Confederate Daimyos, a coinage of his own. He wrote, "What we want is not a treaty with a single potentate, but one binding on and advantageous to the whole country. We must give up the worn-out pretense of acknowledging the tycoon, the shogun, to be the sole ruler of Japan, and take into consideration the existence of other coordinate powers. In other words, we must supplement or replace our present treaties by treaties with the Confederate Daimyos of Japan." And those are his block capitals. Satow felt that this would be welcomed by the shogun himself and would merely be recognizing the actual situation. What Satow envisages here is not, in fact, a treaty with the emperor directly, who would be unable to guarantee that the treaty would be upheld, but with the daimyos, if possible, ratified by the emperor, though this would not be essential. So with all of the daimyos of Japan, the Confederate daimyos. In conclusion, Satow quotes Article 14 in full and repeats the need for it to be enforced as originally intended, so as to give a great stimulus to our own rising trade with Japan. Remember why we're here, guys? We're here for trade. Yes. Okay, good. And then we have the second article. Since the second article, believed to be dated May the 4th, 1866, by Hirose, who wrote a paper in 1961, has not yet been found in Britain, Japan, or the United States, a full retranslation of one of the Japanese versions is given below. I've tried to ensure consistency of style with the first and third articles, which have been published in full in Grace Fox's book, Britain and Japan, published by Oxford University Press in 1969. So here we go. This is my translation from Japanese of Article 2. Yes, Article 2. As we have previously stated, the present treaty should be abolished and a new one made with the Confederate Daimyos of Japan. We are delighted to note that this opinion has been published in newspapers this past 4 or 5 years, and that many people seem to agree with us. The origin of this debate was not with us, but with men of ability, and we continue it as we naturally should. These men of ability are not only foreigners, but also Japanese patriots. Since the signing of the treaty with America in 1858, they seem to have constantly planned such a change. As can be seen in the writings of scholars of the Japanese constitution, in ancient times the tycoon was all-powerful. However, this did not happen, as in many countries, where pretenders arise and kill the emperor, thereby seizing power. Let's just check that I haven't missed anything there. Yes, okay, so the next page. It began with the Fujiwara clan, which over many years married daughters off to become imperial princesses, and so the Fujiwara descendants achieved imperial status. Then the Fujiwaras were able to use imperial power for their own private gain. At last, all power was entrusted to the hands of the Fujiwaras, and the emperor was only allowed to spend his days and nights composing songs and poetry and indulging in other pleasures. The Fujiwara clan became most powerful under Michinaga Yorimichi. So it's a kind of takeover, isn't it, by one clan? Yeah. Michinaga Yorimichi. Then Emperor Sanjo tried to and partly succeeded in restoring his sovereign power, but he died a short time later. Furthermore, from 1069 to about 1072 AD, I think there is one too many twos there, Minamoto Yoritomo conquered the Heishi and established domination. This was the beginning of the usurpation of power by the military families. The Tokugawa clan, with whom we foreigners have signed a treaty, can trace his pretended authority back to the time of Yoritomo. However, even if we continue our intercourse with these pretenders, if another pretender should arise and rival them, we may not know what to do in this event. The Dutchman Kesheru, that's actually Kemper, who resided only in Nagasaki and who was not conversant with the Japanese polity, the structure, polity, something like constitution. It's a political setup of a country. Wrote of two rulers. One of them was the secular emperor, the real ruler of the state. The other was the ecclesiastical emperor, a kind of pope called the Mikado. And when the foreigners came requesting treaties of amity and commerce, this most important point, that the daimyos and the Mikado should be consulted and the Mikado's will be obeyed, was ignored by the tycoon, who felt pressure for an answer from the foreign powers. He was unavoidably drawn into signing the treaty on his own, and thereby committing fraud, as Satow later states. This was like opening the castle gates to the enemy. The foreigners began intercourse believing that the treaty had been made with the sovereign in perpetuity. Since then, with the blessing of heaven, we foreigners have spent our days without difficulty, and the tycoon has gone to Kyoto sometimes on the emperor's command, thereby greatly injuring his authority. The tycoon, Shogun, should know that this is the result of him not paying respect to the emperor over several years and conducting business by himself. Also, that tycoon's authority came to be despised by his own relatives. Spending a lot of money and manpower, he did not manage to control one rebel clan called Mito. With the help of daimyos close to him, he just about managed to suppress Mito. For 1 year, he strongly demanded the heads of Choshu rebels, and he dispatched military force from Edo. The measures taken by the tycoon were not only prevented by Kyoto, but he also aimlessly sent his first minister to Choshu under false pretenses to make them obey and settle peacefully, which was a great shame on him. Now no one believes that the tycoon is master of Japan. When he could not control the daimyos who were supposed to obey him, neither they nor the foreigners had a reason to respect him as the ruler of Japan. I think that's the end of the page. Yes, it is. Okay, next page. An event which happened 4 years ago shows clearly that it was a great mistake for the foreign powers to sign a treaty with the tycoon, the shogun. In September 1863, that's probably should be 1862, perhaps that's what the note says. Anyway, in September 1863, a murder took place which the present tycoon's government knew about, and they had the power to punish the wrongdoers. But because they evaded responsibility, it became clear that they could not control the state or enter agreements on its behalf. Our attack on Kagoshima was made to put a stop to the thoughtless aggression. From this time, it was clear that each daimyo controlled his own country independently and moved of his own will. So September 1863 is wrong. It should be 1862, and it's talking about the Namamugi incident in which Charles Lennox Richardson was murdered. Kind of key incident in the early part of the Bakumatsu period, the end of the Tokugawa shogunate. You could say, well, the end game began perhaps in 1862 with this murder. When we signed an agreement with the potentate of Choshu, we got certain proof of the tycoon's order for expulsion of foreigners, and it became a very good chance to ask severe questions of the tycoon's ministers in Edo. At this time, Britain's minister, Shuttle Arukoku, this is a Japanese misunderstanding of Sir Rutherford Alcock, Shuttle Arukoku, was called back home to discuss revision of the treaty between our people and the Japanese, which should be ceaselessly promoted on firm foundations. There has been no good opportunity to achieve revision yet, but our envoy has powers, so he will without any doubt be able to accomplish it soon. And we hope thus to increase our intercourse with the Japanese people according to the theory we have advanced. Here are my remarks on the second article. Let's just go down a bit. Okay. Remarks on the second article. There are several mistakes in the Japanese version from which this translation was made. The first Japanese translation was probably handwritten by Satow or his Japanese teacher, Numata Torasaburo. Various copies were then made. The version above seems to be from a kappan woodblock print. Nobutoshi Hagiwara in Toigake quoted from a different version which refers to the Shimonoseki affair or incident, about bombardment of Shimonoseki. Excuse me. Apart from tracing the historical background of the shogun's rise to supremacy, the chief importance of the article is in showing how the shogun came to sign the Treaty of Edo for the whole of Japan, and it also highlights the significance of the Namamugi incident as proof of his powerlessness. Right. Oh dear, oops. The third article. At the beginning of the third article, dated May 19th, 1866, Satow states his intention of going into more detail to show by looking at the treaty articles how wrong the shogun had been to sign the treaty in a character which did not belong to him, i.e. as ruler of the whole of Japan, how he had shown himself unable to uphold his side of the bargain, and how the treaty and trade regulations were quite inadequate. In particular, he focuses on the regulations. However, it is first to nomenclature which Satow turns. He states that the title of tycoon has been wrongly arrogated by the shogun. In fact, it is a title which belongs to the emperor. This is what he says in the third article. The shogun, or shogun, or sigun, as his name is indifferently spelt, has signed a treaty with the representatives of foreign powers under another and more dignified appellation to which he has no right. This may, Satow concedes, be a seemingly minor point, but a combination of small arguments may yet win the day, and even the small arguments are worth accumulating if there is nothing better. In English, the title of Tycoon is properly rendered by Majesty and so belongs to the Emperor, whereas the title Shogun is merely equivalent to Highness and no more. Satow then looks in detail at the preamble of the treaty, the 1858 treaty we're talking about, aren't we? Her Majesty the Queen of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, and His Majesty the Tycoon of Japan, being desirous to place the relations between the two countries on a permanent and friendly footing, he, that is Satow, notes that there is a mistaken assumption in this sentence that the Tycoon has sovereign power over the whole of Japan. The reality is thus that the British have signed a treaty with the master of Edo and the 8 provinces around it. No treaty exists between Britain and the great daimyos of Sendai, Choshu, or Satsuma, or other areas. On the main individual articles, Satow comments thus. Article 4 on the extent of British jurisdiction is defective because it is claimed only for the territories of the Tycoon. Other daimyos could still torture or decapitate unfortunate foreigners who might stray to into their territory, and if they wished to display their skulls in a museum of European curiosities. Gosh. Article 5 about punishing Japanese who commit crimes against British subjects is a dead letter for those living outside the jurisdiction of the Edo officials, for example, Satsuma and Choshu, living in Satsuma or Choshu. Satsuma, Kagoshima. Here, Satow clearly had the Namamugi incident and attacks on the legation uppermost in his mind. So, of course, the Namamugi incident was an attack on a foreigner by the Satsuma clan. Article 6, suggesting a mixed court, Japanese authorities and consul, to settle disputes, has been ignored in practice. Difficult cases have too often been referred to the custom house, a place where justice to the foreigner is utterly unknown. Gosh. Article 7, on the recovery of debts and punishment of fraudulent debtors, is dismissed wryly by Satow as a subject which is too painful to foreign creditors to be discussed in detail. Article 8 concerns the lawful employment of Japanese by British subjects. No restrictions should be placed on such employment. This, Satow claims, is persistently violated by the Shogun's officials. Article 12 provides for the good treatment of shipwrecked sailors, but like Article 4 is limited to the territory of the Tycoon or Shogun. I think we're going to the next page. Oops, maybe we have to go like this. Article 14, already discussed above, is the most important commercial article in the treaty. Satow states, from the opening of the ports, it has been consistently violated. Our trade with Japan is crippled by its being a dead letter, our social intercourse with the people checked, and all advance towards amity rendered impossible. It is one of the strongest reasons Satow can find for demanding a new treaty. Article 15 concerns the valuations of merchandise by the Shogun's custom house. It gave carte blanche to the officials to value goods as they liked and levy duty on that valuation. Again, Satow attacked the provision. The patient and defrauded British merchant can best tell his representatives how this article has been observed. Patient and defrauded. That's not very nice, is it? Satow's concluding remarks. At the end of the third article of the Japan Times, Satow stridently and forcefully summarizes his position. The Shogun has fraudulently concluded treaties with Western powers. He is not only unable to enforce many agreed items, but also he does not choose to observe those points he is capable of observing. The result will be political crisis in Japan and the disruption of trade. It is for those who have the power to resolve the problem, i.e. the foreign representatives, to bring about the abrogation of the treaty now in force and the negotiation of a more comprehensive settlement with the real rulers of Japan, the emperor and all of the daimyos. So now we've got, it's not just the Confederate daimyos he wants a treaty with, he wants a treaty with the emperor and all of the daimyos. In using the term fraudulently, Satow is harsh. He conveniently forgets that the shogun was, as Satow says in his own words in the second article, pressured by the foreigners, Gai Atsu is foreign pressure, into signing the treaty. He also ignores the fact that there was in 1858 no tradition of Western-style treaty making in Japan. The only systems with which the shogun was familiar were the Chinese tributary system and his own exclusion policy, sakoku. Here is an attempt to impose Western values on the Eastern context. However, Satow's criticism was no doubt well received by the readership of the Japan Times in the foreign settlements, who were mainly merchants and would have had no qualms about such cultural imperialism. Assessment of the influence of Eikoku Sakuron. Now, this probably needs updating in the light of Professor Machida's research. How important was Satow's writing? What influence did it exert on the thinking of foreigners and Japanese in the critical years before the Meiji Restoration? There's no doubt that the Japanese translation was widely read throughout Japan. Saigo Takamori certainly read it, as he discussed the issues posed with Satow. Moreover, it was generally but incorrectly assumed to be an official statement of British policy, which was in fact politically neutral. Well, why was it so assumed? Well, because it was given the title Eikoku Sakuron, which is translatable into English as British policy. So it didn't have a title in the original Japan Times, but it got a title. And it also, Satow was named in the translation, the Japanese translation, which was not a good look for Ernest Satow, of course, at least in terms of his professional life. Although in terms of his status or his reputation with the Japanese people, it was a good thing, I suppose. As such, its influence is difficult to measure, but it was no doubt substantial. The idea that the influence was difficult to measure comes from Grace Fox's book, published in 1969. I'm sure that she found it difficult to measure. We really needed a Japanese scholar like Professor Machida to do some measuring for us. Did Sir Harry Parkes, British minister and Satow's boss, know that Satow had written the articles? Grace Fox found no evidence in his letters that indicated his support or knowledge of Satow's activities. Yet he may well have known of them and disapproved of Satow's disobedience of the clear instructions regarding neutrality issued from London. This is what Sir Hugh Kotatsi wrote in 1994. Satow himself admitted in his memoirs that it was doubtless very, this is diplomat in Japan, it was doubtless very irregular, very wrong, and altogether contrary to the rules of the service, but I thought little of that. Okay. If Parkes knew and disapproved of Satow's articles, why did he not confront his wayward junior official? Here we may speculate that Parkes was in fact not unhappy about the possible influence of the translated pamphlet. A gap may well have existed between the official British policy of neutrality, as dictated by faraway London, and unofficial tacit support in Japan itself of the imperialist faction, including Satsuma and Choshu, against the shogunate. The French under Léon Roche were, after all, openly supporting the shogun. Another possibility is that Parkes realized, as Alcock had before him, that Satow was by far the best linguist available to the legation and just too valuable to him. If he chose to make an issue of the articles, Satow might well have resigned. Well, we know that he was dabbling in journalism, and his father had written about, or was writing about him becoming a lawyer, and so. Indeed, shortly afterwards, in August 1866, Satow did ask for his resignation to be accepted, although he stayed in the consular service on learning that he would get a raise in pay. Okay, so, whoops. Oh dear, I've gone backwards. Okay, let's carry on. The articles, of course, went beyond treaty revision to the question of who ultimately held sovereignty in Japan. The power to make treaties is one of the sovereign powers under international law. As such, Eikoku Sakuron must have served as a catalyst for the Meiji Restoration and is a good example of the pressure from without known as Gaiatsu. Well, I've had people disagree with me about whether it might have been a catalyst, but Professor Machida has said repeatedly that it had a huge influence, and he's got some data to back up that claim. So I think, now, shall I talk about his data now, or shall I just go on to the next page? Well, that is in fact just the end. Well, these are just end notes. Okay. I don't think I will read all of the end notes. I can just, if you want to read them, pause the video here so I can read those first 5 there. And there's another 6 end notes, and then there are the references. Again, if you want to investigate the references, please pause the video here. Oops. Go down to the end, shall we? If I can. Oh, why can't I? Just a minute. Keep going, keep going. Oh, there we are. Okay. Right. And yes, my sincere thanks to Professor Ishikawa of KIT, that's Kyushu Institute of Technology, for his help with the reading, the yomikata of the old Japanese text on which the retranslation into English of the second article is based. Also to Mr. Shozo Nagaoka of Kamakura for obtaining the Japanese text from Tokyo University of Foreign Studies, and for his helpful comments on my translation, and to Professor George Russell for his comments. Any residual errors are mine. All right. So that was my paper back in the day, 1996. I just want to go to this part here. This is from Grace Fox's book, Britain and Japan, and published by Oxford in University Press, or the Clarendon Press at Oxford in 1969. And I suppose I can read the whole thing. Why don't I? It's not that long. Okay, so it's Appendix 2 of Grace Fox's book, starting at page, does it say? It doesn't say. Oh dear, why doesn't it say? Does it say at the bottom? Page numbers? Hope so, just a minute. No, I don't see any page numbers at the bottom either. How has that happened? Okay. So starting at page 566, Appendix 2, 2 of the 3 articles by Ernest Satow on English policy, not British policy, but English policy, A. Kokusakaron, 1866. I think British policy is better, really, but okay. So the Japan Times, a commercial, political, and general weekly newspaper, Volume 1, number 28, Yokohama, Friday, March the 16th, 1866. It repeats the date there. Okay. Accustomed as are the foreign merchants of Yokohama to see in their port vessels of war flying the flag of the morning sun, the arrival of a merchant steamer with the private ensign of an independent daimyo at the main still cannot occur at present without causing some slight degree of excitement. Such an occurrence has taken place within the last few days. A vessel belonging to the Prince of Satsuma, which left Hakodate some months since, on a surveying expedition to the islands of Sodo and Oki on the northwest coast of Japan, I think that might be Sado, dropped her anchor in this harbor last week, and the captain, in accordance with Article 14 of our treaty, proposed to sell European merchants certain Japanese produce which he had on board. Okay, so it's a Satsuma ship and they want to trade with Britain. The native authorities refused to allow the officers and crew to land, the native authorities being the shogunal authorities, and as a necessary consequence, the trade intended to be done was likewise prohibited. Here is certainly a case in which the Chamber of Commerce might, with good reason, lay a charge against the Japanese government of hindering our commercial intercourse with the agents of a daimyo, appeal to the article in the treaty to which we have referred, and call on the foreign representatives for their interference. For reasons which we will proceed to state, it is unlikely, however, that such remonstrance would have any effect. The fact is, as may be learned from blue books, diplomatic manuals, or records of exchanges between nations, that in previous years the Japanese government have been requested to take some measure against the entrance of daimyo's retainers into this settlement because, in consequence of the unfortunate occurrence during our early intercourse with the country in which the two-sworded class played so large a part, they were generally supposed to, let's go to the next page, supposed to entertain hostility and dangerous designs against foreigners. The native authorities, having thus been requested in general terms to take precautions, have adopted measures which seem to them insufficient and cannot be reasonably called upon now to abrogate their own regulations hurriedly and to suit a particular case. And we cannot but acknowledge that, if our intercourse with daimyo's trading agents is circumscribed and subject to espionage, we have ourselves to thank for it in the main. Far from wishing, however, to accuse the foreign representatives of having neglected the interests of their countrymen, we maintain that, in view of our peculiar relations with this country, no other course was open to them. It must be borne in mind that the Tycoon, though claiming to conduct the government of Japan, is in reality, or was at the time when the first treaties were made, only the head of a confederation of princes, and to arrogate to himself the title of ruler in a country of which only about half was subject to his jurisdiction was a piece of extraordinary presumption on his part. It cannot justly be matter of wonder that the independent daimyos, already possessing many grounds for dissatisfaction with the Tycoon, should refuse their approval to measures in which they were never even consulted. The natural consequence was a strongly manifested hostility on their part, which gave rise to apprehensions in the mind of the Tycoon's ministers, as well as of the foreign representatives, of indefinable dangers. The entrance of daimyo's retainers into the open ports was therefore strictly prohibited. Just moving to, there we are. As time wore on, the daimyos became alive to the advantages of foreign trade and, by pressure on the Tycoon, obtained the great concession of a privilege to purchase arms, subject always to the supervision of Yedo officials, Tokyo officials eventually. Well, Edo became Tokyo. But Yedo was the spelling at this point, not Edo. This supervision, stigmatized rather unfairly as espionage, was necessary to secure to the Tycoon the acknowledgement of the right which he possessed, according to treaty, of being sole purchaser of munitions of war, Article 14. And as it was foreigners who, in the first place, desired the total exclusion of daimyo's retainers, they cannot fairly grumble at the present partial restriction of free intercourse with the class whom they had themselves should be entirely should be entirely excluded from the open ports. Maybe there should be a verb in there, stated that they had themselves stated, or something like that. Not quite sure. But from being purchasers of arms only, the daimyos have gradually come to be desirous of selling the produce collected in their provinces, doubtless in order to pay for their previous investments, and their position in relation to foreign merchants is entirely changed. It is not intended to discuss the policy of erecting these princes into gigantic monopolists to the exclusion of legitimate traders from among their own subjects. But if it be considered a desirable thing, go to the next page, go across, to let them bring goods to market, let us endeavor to arrange the matter to the satisfaction of all parties concerned. It is a well ascertained fact that the so-called hostile daimyos are now alive to the advantages of foreign commerce and intercourse with Europeans, and it is even alleged that some of them wish to open ports in their own territories. By all means, let it be done, so far as is convenient, but consideration will show that it would be impossible and useless, if possible, to have a port in the territory of every independent daimyo, for their number amounts to nearly 20, far beyond the number of ports required for the development of trade. One or two would perhaps suffice, and it is allowed that the opening of these would be a very useful measure. Thank you, Ernest, for allowing that. Sorry, shouldn't be flippant. So long, however, as we continue to have a treaty with the Tycoon only, and not with Japan, this will never take place. At present, the daimyos are not bound by the treaty and have no interest in it whatever. They are only called on to acknowledge the existence of treaties with the Tycoon and to abstain from obstructing their execution. We gravely and seriously advocate a radical change. What we want is not a treaty with a single potentate, but one binding on and advantageous to everyone in the country. We must give up the worn-out pretense of acknowledging the Tycoon to be sole ruler of Japan and take into consideration the existence of other coordinate powers. In other words, we must supplement or replace our present treaties by treaties with the Confederate Daimyos of Japan. There is every reason to believe that a proposal to discuss the matter on such a basis would not only prove acceptable to the princes, but also to the harassed and perplexed cabinet of the Tycoon, which would be relieved from many of its present embarrassments by the participation of the daimyos in the advantages of trade. It would not be a political revolution, deposing the Tycoon from the position which he arrogated as head of the government, for that has taken place already. It would be merely recognizing the actual state of affairs. Interesting. That the treaties at present in force are not designed to be permanent, everyone is by this time convinced. We have lately seen the Tycoon acknowledge by his actions that without the sanction of the Mikado, the emperor, they would never be carried out or be recognized by the daimyos, and from this men have naturally and reasonably concluded the Mikado to be the superior. A notion, however, has arisen out of this that a treaty with the Mikado would be a good thing. No doubt to a treaty made with the daimyos, the sanction of the titular emperor would be necessary, or at least desirable, but he could not enter into a treaty himself, or he would be unable to enforce its observance. Between the present time and January the 1st, 1868, on which date Hyogo, that is Kobe, as we know it now, is to be opened, there is ample time for negotiations with the daimyos, for discussing every point hitherto in dispute, for settling what new ports shall be opened, and in which daimyos' territories, and for establishing our relations generally on a secure and permanent footing. Unless some arrangement is come to before that date, we fear that we shall not enter on residence at the port without resort to coercion and bloodshed. If we would avert such misfortunes, we must treat with the daimyos, for they are responsible rulers of the country, equally with the Tycoon. The gods themselves cannot fight against the inevitable, and though somewhat reluctantly, we have no doubt that the Tycoon's cabinet will yield, with very slight pressure, to the conviction that Article 14 of the treaty with their master cannot longer be treated as a dead letter. Cannot longer be treated as a dead letter. That article affirms that at each of the ports open to trade, British subjects shall be at full liberty to import from their own or other ports and sell there and purchase therein and export to their own or any other ports all manner of merchandise, not contraband, paying the duties thereon as laid down in the tariff annexed to the present treaty, and no other charges whatsoever. With the exception of munitions of war, which shall only be sold to the Japanese government, i.e. what was then supposed to be Japanese government, the government of the Tycoon, and foreigners, they may freely buy from Japanese and sell to them any articles that either may have for sale without intervention of any Japanese officers in such purchase or sale, or in making or receiving payment for the same, and all classes of Japanese may purchase, sell, keep, or use any article sold to them by British subjects. Not only has the observation of this article been always consistently refused by the Tycoon's government, which is natural enough, but we ourselves have been, ever since the panics in 1862-3, when we requested the Yedo authorities to exclude from the foreign settlement of Yokohama the whole class of daimyos retainers, thereby very foolishly playing into the hands of the ministers of the one powerful prince with whom we had made a treaty as titular sovereign of Japan. Recent events have proved that we were in error in assigning to this great daimyo, Tokugawa, such a position of sovereignty, and we are certain that the measure of reform we advocate, though a sweeping one, will have the great and unusual advantage of being received with favor by all parties interested, by the tycoon and his cabinet, as relieving them from domestic, next page, go over to the left, domestic trouble and jealousies, by the daimyos as opening to them new springs of wealth, by the people of the country, and by foreign traders for the same reason. Therefore, we earnestly commend the matter to the best consideration of the representatives of the treaty powers, convinced that not only will the measure be of immense benefit to the country, but that a great stimulus will be also given to our own rising trade with Japan. So that was the first article, and as we've already found out, the second article does not exist in, or we couldn't find, it couldn't be found in the original English. So I retranslated back into English from one of the Japanese versions. And here we've got the third article, Volume 1, number 36 of the Japan Times, a commercial, political, and general weekly newspaper, Yokohama, Saturday, May 19th, 1866. While advocating lately the abrogation of the existing treaty with the Tycoon and the substitution of a more equitable and comprehensive convention with the Mikado and the Confederated Daimyos of Japan, we have hitherto contented ourselves with stating the broader arguments in favor of the measure. The idea is a bold and a startling one, and it was necessary that the minds of those whose interest in the matter we wished to arouse should be gradually accustomed to it. The arguments we have to bring forward against the existing state of things are, besides, so numerous that it was impossible to adduce them all within the limited space of 1 or 2 articles. Our intention at present is to go more into particulars than heretofore, and taking the provisions of the existing treaty in detail, to strengthen the position we have thought it right to take up in opposition to the continuance of the present arrangements, by showing how completely wrong was the Tycoon, the Shogun, in taking the first step of signing in a character which did not belong to him, how utterly incapable he has since proved himself to be of carrying out his own engagements, and finally, how generally insufficient are the treaty and trade regulations for commercial as well as international purposes. On the first 2 points, we have already dilated to some extent, though we have still something to say with regard to them, but it is more particularly to the consideration of the subject from the third point of view that we wish to direct our readers' attention today. Students of Japanese politics and literature may perhaps accuse us of pedantry in remarking now that the title of Tycoon is one to which the Mikado alone has right, but there are many circumstances which prevent the bulk of our readers from the study of these subjects, and it is for the many that we write, not for the few. The Shogun, or Shogun, or Sigun, as his name is indifferently spelt, has signed a treaty with the representatives of foreign powers under another and more dignified appellation, to which he has no right. In fact, were there no more cogent reasons to absolve the Western powers from the observance of the existing treaty, the fatal technical flaw undoubtedly exists that the Edo potentate has signed a contract to which the letter of the word makes him no party. We cannot fairly blame the representatives of foreign powers for accepting him as a high contracting party to the treaty they were anxious to make with this country. Nor can we say with justice that they were deceived by his assumption of a dignity which did not belong to him. It was a matter of total indifference to them, as may be proved by reference to Lord Elgin's dispatches on the subject, by what title he chose to be called, so long as he really was, as he pretended to be, and as they believed him to be, the real and bona fide sovereign of the country. We should be the last to urge upon our diplomatists the occupation of such ground for a revision of the existing treaty, had we no better standpoint. But as we have missed the splendid opportunity afforded us by the proved treachery of the Shogun in the affair of Shimonoseki, we need a combination of small locus standi to give our representatives secure foothold, and we cannot afford to throw away a single point d'appui, point of support, or point in our favor, argument in our favor. We may reasonably object with justice to this individual daimyo arrogating to himself the designation of majesty, vide Lord Elgin's dispatches, passim, which belongs only to sovereigns. If Tokugawa is majesty, what is the Mikado? The Mikado, who is always spoken of as the supreme dignitary of the empire and the extortion of whose real or pretended sanction to the treaty made with the shogun is held to be the great diplomatic success of the past year. The shogun is in fact is always styled Highness by the Japanese themselves, and Highness he is, and no more. Let us note here the effect of this error of designation. The preamble of the treaty runs thus. Her Majesty the Queen of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, that's Queen Victoria, of course, and His Majesty the Tycoon of Japan, being desirous to place the relations between the two countries on a permanent and friendly footing, etc., etc. Here is evidence the assumption of sovereign power over the whole of Japan, a mistake carefully avoided afterwards, because though the Tycoon of Japan is spoken of throughout the whole treaty, reference to the country is always made by the expression his territories or his dominions, phrases which to the Japanese had a meaning widely different to that assigned to them by our diplomatists. This preamble really should run thus. Her Majesty the Queen of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland and His Highness the Shogun, being desirous of placing the relations between their respective dominions and territories on a friendly footing, etc. Thus, the words of the treaty would have corresponded to what is actually the fact, that we have a treaty with the master of Edo and the 8 provinces round it, and with a few outlying spots scattered through the islands of Dai-Nippon, but with Sendai, Choshu, Satsuma, and the other great daimyos, we can claim no more than what they may choose to consider the general duties of man to man may require. This is absolutely our position at present, one of great difficulty, and from which we see no means of extrication, but that we suggest the additional complication of the question when Osaka is opened, and we find ourselves in the immediate neighborhood of the Mikado and several powerful chiefs, all busily intriguing against the Yedo usurper. We leave our readers to imagine. Let us now pass the treaty, such as it is, in review. The first article of any importance is Article 3, providing for the opening of certain ports and towns, and we need not again tell the oft-told tale of its persistent and vexatious violation. Article 4, all questions in regard to rights, whether of property or person, arising between British subjects in the dominions of His Majesty the Tycoon of Japan, shall be subject to the jurisdiction of the British authorities. This is very good as far as the dominions of His Majesty the Shogun are concerned, but it does not preclude, nor would it in the least degree prevent the Prince of Owari, that's Nagoya area, from decapitating any British subject who ventured to land in his dominions, nor him of Hizen from putting to death with agonizing torture any unfortunates shipwrecked on his coasts, whose skulls he might wish to place in his Museum of European Curiosities. Article 5, Japanese subjects who may be guilty of any criminal act towards British subjects shall be arrested and punished by the Japanese authorities according to the laws of Japan. Justice shall be equitably and impartially administered on both sides. The first clause of this has been occasionally put in force when the offender has happened to live under the jurisdiction of the Edo officials, but it is a dead letter as regards the retainers of other daimyos, as has been proved in the cases of Satsuma and Choshu. Go to the other side. We need not weary our readers with again drawing the obvious inference. Article 6 is a good and necessary one, to wit. Article 6, a British subject having reason to complain of a Japanese must proceed to the consulate and state his grievance. The consul will inquire into the merits of the case and do his utmost to arrange it amicably. In like manner, if a Japanese have reason to complain of a British subject, the consul shall no less listen to his complaint and endeavour to settle it in a friendly manner. If disputes take place of such a nature that the consul cannot arrange them amicably, then he shall request the assistance of the Japanese authorities, that they may together examine into the merits of the case and decide it equitably. The mixed court suggested in the latter part of this article would, if established on a proper basis and guided in its procedure by well-considered rules, be of infinite service. I think there'd already been mixed courts operating in Egypt at this time. Oh, no, I'm not sure. Or with that later, I don't know. The subject is too large to treat here. At present, experience shows us that this most important part of it has been too frequently overlooked, and our consuls, instead of arranging amicably disputes between foreigners and Japanese or calling in the native authorities to aid them in deciding cases too difficult to manage alone, have too often relegated the disputants to the custom house altogether, a place where justice to the foreigner is utterly unknown. Article 7 provides for the recovery of debts and punishment of fraudulent debtors. The subject is too painful to foreign creditors to allow of our dwelling on it. Celebrated Article 8, that the Japanese government will place no restrictions whatever upon the employment by British subjects of Japanese in any lawful capacity, has been and is persistently and continually violated daily and hourly by the officials of the Shogun. The article is noticeable as containing the assumption that the officials at Edo are the Japanese government. Articles 9 and 10, providing for the free exercise of religion and the currency regulations, we need not here discuss, while to the provisions of Article 11 we profess utter indifference. Strong words. Satow is quite he has strong opinions, and he's not afraid to state them in print. Article 12, providing for the good treatment of shipwrecked mariners, applies only to the dominions of the Shogun and will not protect any castaways on the coasts of other potentates. The Edo authorities appear to have been conscious of this when they officially requested the foreign ministers to issue notifications to the effect that shipwrecks should not only be allowed at the open ports except in cases of urgent necessity. I see. Okay. Article 13, regulating pilotage, refers only to the open ports. We now come to Article 14, engaging that at these open ports, we're on to the last page here, British subjects may freely import and export goods and trade freely with all classes of Japanese, and without the intervention of any Japanese authorities in such purchase or sale, or in making or receiving payment for the same. This is the most important commercial article in the treaty. From the opening of the ports, it has been consistently violated. Scores of well-authenticated cases can be quoted of its infraction. Our trade with Japan is crippled by its being a dead letter, our social intercourse with the people checked, and all advance towards amity rendered impossible. The non-observance of this article is one of the strongest points the ministers have for demanding a new treaty, and until reform in this particular is obtained, neither our own trade nor the resources of this empire can ever be developed. So we need a new treaty. The old one, even if it's ratified by the emperor, is inadequate. Article 15 provides that the Shogun's custom house officials, if dissatisfied, is that a spelling mistake only, with the valuation placed by a merchant on goods passing through their hands, shall value them for themselves and either receive duty on such valuation or take over the merchandise. The patient and defrauded British merchant can best tell his representatives how this article has been observed. Not observed, in other words, I suppose. The same remarks made on Article 14 apply with equal force to Article 16, providing for the free and untrammeled transit through the country of goods that have once paid the import duties at the open ports. In addition, we have only to note the magnificent audacity of a chief whose authority extends over only 8 provinces of the empire, that's the Shogun, engaging that none of his peers shall levy custom dues at their own frontiers. The remaining articles of the treaty are almost all either insignificant or of no importance to the present discussion. We note the famous Article 23, the favored nation clause, latest invention of diplomacy, whereby the negotiator tries to supply the deficiencies of his memory or of his imagination. It might be pertinently asked whether the privileges and immunities, relaxation of duties, repeated grants of land for the same purpose, large gifts of extra ichibo exchange, etc., allowed to some individuals of the foreign community by the custom house, are to be considered as sanctioned by the Shogun's government. In such case, we think we could name some nationalities who have large arrears to receive, to place them on a par with more favored nations. But our subject is exhausted. In the series of articles published in these columns on the question, we maintain, fully and conclusively proved that the shogun has deceived the representatives of the Western powers and fraudulently concluded treaties, many of whose provisions he is unable to carry out, that other clauses which he can observe if he will, if he wants to, in other words, he persistently violates, that the continuance of the existing arrangements are likely to lead to a political crisis in Japan and the great disturbance of our trade, and that this trade can never, under present regulations, acquire the importance and value which is its due. We leave the question now in the hands of those who have the power of bringing it to a solution, in the earnest hope that at no distant date we may see the present treaty abrogated in favor of a more comprehensive and satisfactory one, a fair and equitable convention with the Mikado, the Emperor, and the Confederate Daimyos, the real rulers of Japan. All right, so we will stop the share. I will stop the share here. Powerful stuff, I think. And it's always been of considerable interest to me. But the frustration over the years has been knowing to what extent it had influence among the Japanese people, notably the shogunate and the nobility, people like Iwakura Tomomi and the clans, the daimyos. Recently I've been reading a paper by Professor Machida, and he gives several examples of. We know already that this British policy was published and read widely in Japan by ordinary people or samurai, whatever, as well as by the elite that I've just described. But what was interesting to me is that one of the elders of the shogunate, the Roju, I think that's right, yes, Roju, actually provided the shogun himself, or sorry, the man about to become shogun in 1867, which is Yoshinobu, provided him with a copy of British policy. And by the end of the year, the shogun has returned his power to the emperor. So that is quite interesting. I understand that the shogun was a man who sought to avoid bloodshed and civil war, which was more or less, well, it was certainly on the cards if it wasn't already happening. And there was the Boshin War in 1868. And perhaps he felt that the best way to avoid bloodshed would be for him to effectively step down, which is what he did in, I think, November of 1867, which sounds like it was almost as soon as he decently could. He wasn't shogun for very long, was he? After stepping down, he retired to, I think, Shizuoka. He retired to, and lived a long and presumably happy life. I think he was interested in photography and a few other things, and died, I believe, in 1913, having played his part in the transition from the Tokugawa shogunate, which had lasted for about 250 years, to the Meiji restoration, the restoration of the imperial system, under which we find Japan still today, the Americans having allowed it to continue after World War II. Well, that's a very, very potted summary, but I've been very pleased to discover that this article, about which I have spent quite a long, over which I've spent quite a long time, or this problem of the British policy, that it really was important, and had an enormous influence. Let me give you the Japanese phrase. Jindai na eikyo is the phrase which Professor Machida uses more than once, and that means enormous influence in the transition between the two polities. Okay, I think I've rambled and burdened you enough today, but I hope you enjoyed that, and I shall be putting this up on YouTube as soon as I possibly can. Thank you and goodbye.